the recording voice. Okay. Oops, let me close chat here. Good morning to everybody, and welcome to History Matters, and so does any form of caffeine. Today, as advertised on Twitter, we're going to be talking about, and I couldn't decide what to call it, and I started out with Bully Pulpit, and I added in another half of a title about sort of broadcasting outrage from the national stage. And in one way or another, you already have an idea of what I'm going to be talking about. But before I begin talking about it, let me turn to Grace, who, as always, will wonderfully explain the rules of the game. Well, she will right away. And while she's temporarily taking a moment off, oh, she's back. Okay.
All right, thank you for joining us. I'm Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. I'm joined by a small dog. We're delighted to have you with us here this morning for the 103rd episode of History Matters and So Does Coffee. And we thank Joanne for being with us here every Friday. We're ready for another wonderful discussion, and we hope you join us as well. Please make sure you're participating in the chat. And when you have questions for Joanne, please put them in the Q&A. That way I'll be able to see them, and I'll be able to share them with Joanne after she shares with us some information about the Bully Pulpit. If you enjoy this, please check out our other offerings at ncheteach.org. And you can also see History Matters and So Does Coffee, so do check that out. Thank you all very much, and I'll hand it over to you, Joanne.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so probably not surprisingly, given I mentioned Bully Pulpit and outrage from the national stage, obviously what inspired me this week was the Supreme Court hearing, the confirmation hearing of Ketanji Brown Jackson. I only saw part of it. I heard about much of it, and obviously in some way or another we're probably all aware of it because it got a lot of attention, which is part of what I want to talk about today. But a lot of the commentary on it was essentially in one way or another either people or the press saying, oh, shameless grandstanding, right? Look at them just performing, taking advantage of the moment, acting as though what was going on was just members of a certain party being loud and obnoxious because they had the national spotlight on them, and boy, wasn't that horrible. And there was no real discussion of part of what was going on in behaving that way, part of what was being accomplished and potentially would have an impact, and also the aspect of the context, which some people did talk about, but which was that kind of behavior was in part because it was a Black woman justice who was up being confirmed. And so some of the people in that room didn't have a qualm with that particular woman in front of the room at interrupting her and basically ultimately ignoring her or using her to get across the points that they want to get across. But what I want to talk about are the points that they wanted to get across, not in a way to focus on their individual political import, but rather to talk about what that exercise was about and give that a little bit of historical context. And it is true, we all knew, whether you were Republican, Democrat, Independent, or nothing, we all knew that the nation would be focused on what was happening at the confirmation hearing. We all knew they would get a lot of press coverage, right? So if you have something that you want to say and you want it to get a lot of attention, that would be a good place to say it. That's hardly surprising to say. But what was interesting was the nature of the comments being made that were the most strident and were the loudest were also the least relevant to what was going on in the hearing, right? So there were questions actually about religion. What was Ketanji Brown Jackson's religion? How faithful was she? There was discussion of child pornography. Of course, critical race theory was mixed in the blend somewhere. We had, was it anti-racist baby? We had children's books being sort of yanked into the play. We had a whole variety of things which you seemingly might not talk about or even might think are not appropriate to talk about when you're talking about the confirmation of a justice for the Supreme Court. And there was one instance, I even copied a quote down here, where Ms. Jackson said, when asked, I think about the parade of children's books, I have not reviewed any of those books, any of those ideas. They don't come up in my work as a judge, which I'm respectfully here to address, which was a fine answer. But what I wanted to talk about today was the impact, and actually even more than the impact, the point of that behavior. And what I'm going to argue here today is that in one way or another, what was happening on the national stage and what has happened before is people using it to create a message, to create a vocabulary of outrage or grievance or anger, to create almost a tangible thing that can then be used and deployed by other members of whatever party is acting in that way, that can be deployed by the press, by introducing ideas with a vocabulary that's handy and useful, and then equally important, weaving them together until, and I wrote this down and I knew you would appreciate this, they create a big blob of anger producing grievance that everyone can pull at and use that vocabulary and grab at that energy for political purpose. So part of what we were seeing on that stage really wasn't about the confirmation hearing. Part of what we were seeing during the hearing was the creation of this weaving together of issues that can act as a big blob of outrage and anger that will be very handy during an election. That's part of what we were seeing. So it was the deliberateness of what we were seeing and the fact that it wasn't just empty grandstanding. That's the point that I wanted to make. And there are two historical moments I wanted to point to. One of them is more on target than the other, but I'm going to mention both of them anyway. The two things, so when I was thinking about this yesterday and trying, as always on a Thursday, beginning to panic because I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about. And I thought about this. I thought, well, that's certainly relevant. And the two things that came to my mind were an incident that happened in the 1850s. I'm going to come back. That's going to be the second one. And the election of 1800. Now, the election of 1800 incident is less specifically on target because in that case, it's not necessarily coming from the national stage, but it was the weaving together of ideas and fears in a way that seemed concrete to people and that they believed and acted on in an extreme but very concrete way. So it wasn't just a matter of wow, we don't like these people, we don't like their ideas. It was kind of along the lines of what we've been seeing this past week. You know, what about child pornography? And people thinking, yeah, like if the Democrats get in power, there's going to be child pornography everywhere. It's the concreteness of some of what was going on that echoes in the election of 1800. And the specific point that I wanted to talk about was all of the fear being fueled by New Englanders about the fact that Jefferson wasn't a proper Christian, and thus his election as president would mean the end of Christianity, complete breakdown of American society, that there was that very specific thing that was going to have a concrete social impact and mean the destruction of what Federalists at the time would have told you were American values, right? It's all going down. Everything we value, all going down. And so religion became a really key idea in the election of 1800. Now, there are all kinds of stories. I think a good number of them are apocryphal, but the fact that they're floating around in this period gives you a sense of the spirit of the moment. There are stories about people supposedly burying Bibles in their kitchen gardens because they didn't want them taken away, or hanging their Bibles down a well so that they would be out of the way if someone tried to take them. There's a story about a woman who supposedly took her Bible to a Republican in the town that she lived in and basically gave it to her saying they'll never think of looking in the house of a Democrat for a Bible. So those are probably apocryphal. There were other instances, you know, there's apparently a man in Massachusetts who started building a house during Adams' presidency and then vowed he would not complete it until Christians returned to power. So there was a concrete fear, and it was a fear that there would be real social impact. So it wasn't just let's say nasty things about Jefferson, and then people won't like him. It was, let's spread this very specific message that will give people the idea of the breakdown of American society and the destruction of American values. And let's spread that in every way we can possibly spread it. And so it was obviously in the press. It was people spreading it. And I will be fair and unfair. I'll be fair. I want to say fair to Yale, because I will offer a good Yale quote or a bad Yale quote about spreading this idea during this time period, because Yale, so Connecticut was the center of the Federalist Party, the sort of stronghold of it for a long time. And Yale was in the stronghold, a real stronghold, right? It was like the center of federalism. And Yale President Timothy Dwight was the center of federalism, in the stronghold of federalism, in the state hanging on to federalism. He was the guy at the peak trying to spread this message to convince people that Jefferson in power would mean the breakdown of American society in its entirety. So, and I want to read this in part, and these are Dwight's words, because they echo with the president in such an interesting way. Dwight said that if Jefferson is elected president, the Bible will be, quote, cast into a bonfire, and our children, either wheedled or terrified, uniting in chanting mockeries against God. They're going to indoctrinate our children. That's basically what he's saying. Children, and thus education and teachers are a very handy tool to use in a political context, and that's certainly right here what Dwight is doing. So it's the idea that the Federalists, in one way or another, and in this case, from a loud outpost, right, from Yale, the president of Yale, but still not the national stage, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, but spreading this message, not just mudslinging, but a very concrete message of social disorder, change, anarchy, the breakdown of all that America should be, and that as an activating essence in the coming of an election. Now, of course, it is worth noting that they did not win. And there are a number of reasons for that the Federalists did not win. The Alien and Sedition Acts did not help, right? The Sedition Act trying to, for several reasons, shut people down from criticizing the government during a time of quasi-war. That didn't help. But at any rate, we're not going to go into detail there. It was just the creation of a concrete way to destroy society that can be discussed and pinned to a person, and how that concreteness drives fear. But the thing that came to my mind foremost, and this actually does come from Congress, took place in 1850. Now, I should say before I launch into this, there was a tradition in Congress, and I probably talked about it before, I'm not sure. So I might be, at this point, 103 episodes. It's quite possible I repeat myself any number of times. But at any rate, there was certainly a long-standing tradition in Congress of congressmen standing up and giving these flame-throwing, fist-waving speeches from the floor, aimed really not at anyone in the room, but at people back home. These came to be known as buncombe speeches, B-U-M-C-O-M-B-E, buncombe speeches, because B-U-N, I think I meant to say, not B-U-M, bumcombe, but buncombe, because there was a North Carolina congressman from that area who would give those sort of flaming diatribes all the time, and on at least one occasion, essentially said to the people in the room, this is just for the folks back in Buncombe. Like, this isn't for you. This is for the folks back home. They became known as Buncombe speeches. And that's where the word bunk comes from in the English language, right? A bunch of bunk, a bunch of hooey, a bunch of nonsense. Thank you, Congressman from North Carolina. That's where that comes from. So on the one hand, people knew that these Buncombe speeches were aimed at a different audience. And they were, all full of fiery claims. I mean, they were kind of off the charts. And granted, people in the room, in the House, mostly, more, I think, than the Senate, but people in the House understood that these weren't really aimed at what was going on in Congress. Still, that kind of language coming from the floor got the room in an upset, right? All these charges and claims and insults. There's a North Carolina congressman in this period with the wonderful name David Outlaw, who wrote almost every day to his wife. So he was a wonderful source for me when I was researching my most recent book. And David Outlaw said to his wife, "Buncombe days always produce excitement and fan the bad feeling of which heaven knows there's enough already." So even though everyone knew what was going on, it still affected what was going on in that room. But so that's the tradition here, is that, of course, congressmen get up and they scream and howl at the folks back home to get them to notice. But now let's talk about something a little more specific. And this takes place, the incident that occurred to me when I was thinking about this took place January 22nd, 1850 in Congress. It was during discussion of what comes to be known as the Compromise of 1850. They were talking at this particular moment about whether California coming into the Union would be a free state or a slave state. Interesting, another North Carolinian. I'm sorry, North Carolinians watching, this was not on purpose. But a member of Congress named Thomas Clingman from North Carolina, a Whig from North Carolina, gave a speech in the middle of this that was off the charts, howling and claims and predicting the disintegration of society. And I will quote parts of it here. He stood up and said that if the North intended, quote, to degrade and utterly ruin the South, then we resist. We do not love you, people of the North, enough to become your slaves. And to prevent that from happening, Clingman says that they would do two things. First, they would, quote, fight as Northern gentlemen if things got ugly in Congress. And by that, they meant being polite about the fighting and using calls for adjournment and calls for yeas and nays to prolong things and prevent voting, bringing the government to a halt. But if fighting like Northern gentlemen failed, then, he said, they were going to fight like Southerners, and that meant violence. So if Northerners tried to do anything that was going to block slavery in California or block Southerners who were behaving badly on the floor. So if there were people in Congress who said, you know what, you guys are like really misbehaving, get out. Clingman says, if Northerners try to expel us when we are making all of this trouble, essentially, he said, there will be bloodshed. Quote, let them try that experiment, he said. Washington was slaveholding country, quote, and we do not intend to leave it. The end result, he predicted, would be a collision as electric as the Battle of Lexington, followed by the collapse of Congress. Now, that was extreme. That was really extreme. It was extreme enough that when I was researching the response to it, there was at least one Northern newspaper that said, and this was in the early days of the Telegraph, which means these words were extreme and then they were immediately spread around the country. There's one newspaper that said, you know, we got this speech from Mr. Clingman in Washington, and the Telegraph must have like malfunctioned in some way because we can't quite believe he said this. Like, did he really say this? We're really not sure if he said this. But what you saw there in that seemingly off the charts speech was the creation of kind of a vocabulary of resistance, right? Of an image that he was presenting out, throwing out, of what people would be willing to do, about what Southerners would be willing to do, what that would look like, that became handy, and that in one way or another was talked about, again, from members of Congress and out in the community again and again and again. It was a kind of waving of a flag for the first time, and other people sort of grabbed the flag and ran with it. Yeah, like, actually, that's a great image. So the idea comes up again during the Compromise of 1850 debate. And it springs up again in newspapers in a variety of different places. And the simple idea of it, you know, there must be extreme resistance to the North because they're going to try to destroy our society and we will not be slaves to them. So that justifies everything, including that kind of behavior. It's not only coming from Thomas Clingman of North Carolina, but by standing up before the country, saying something that was so extreme that it made, I don't know how many, but let's just say zillions of newspapers covered it. It became the talk of what was going on at that moment, which in part was what he wanted. But it started to create this vocabulary of fear and anger and resistance that worked, that stayed, that stuck around. And, when I was researching what happens after that point for my book, you could see that idea echoed again and again, that, that we need to do what we need to do because they're coming for us. They're going to make us their slaves. At the end of the book, really touchingly, there's a moment, the main character at the core of the book, lurking over my shoulder, is a clerk, or former clerk at this point, named Benjamin Brown French. And he's the head of the Masons in the United States. So he's very high up. And right before the war breaks out, he thinks and actually writes a statement that he sends out to Masons around the country. And what it basically says is, look, we are a united community in some way or another. Like there's a lot of us. And between us all, we know a lot of other people. So if the Masons come together right now and try and unite the country, we could do a really good service. This would be a good thing. Can we try as Masons to counter the force of what appears to be happening right now? And he gets back from a Mason in Virginia, a letter that essentially echoes some of what we're hearing here. Oh no, they're going to try to make us slaves. They're going to invade our homes and our firesides. They're coming for us. We know they're coming for us. People have been saying that forever. There's absolutely no way. And you are an idiot to suggest that we're going to come together somehow at this moment. We're not. So you can see this individual, you can feel the anger and outrage in his letter, again, not being born of Mr. Thomas Clingman from a speech in 1850, but the loudness and the projection of that extreme idea that Southerners in Congress are first going to be polite to resist what's happening, but if the politeness doesn't work and the North does anything to try and resist what they're doing, well, then they're just going to pull off the stops and there's going to be bloodshed because it deserves that, because they're trying to destroy the South. That idea becomes kind of like, Jefferson is no Christian and he's going to destroy Christianity and society, becomes a concrete kind of fear, which in the case of Jefferson didn't have a lot of oomph to it. In the case of what's happening here, you could argue a lot of things about what Northerners might have done without the Civil War to the South. But even so, what I'm talking about here is not just performing on the part of members of Congress and not just obstructing on the part of members of Congress. I'm talking about constructing a vocabulary of fear, a kind of web of fear and grievances with the nation watching that will be handy and available for use, and that will echo some of what's already been said, but bring it all together into, as I put it, I wrote here, big blob of fear and grievance. Bring it all together, echo some of the strands of what's being said, bring them together in one occasion, link them with each other, focus them on one person. But in this case, the one person is almost expendable to them because there's not a lot of respect for that one person going on. But that moment is very useful for what they want to do. And oh, look at that, I'm now the student who didn't turn off her phone. That using that moment to make those sorts of claims in the face of this woman who's trying to be confirmed for the Supreme Court also is part of the message too, the disrespect of that moment. But even so, there was a moment of making all of these extreme claims, linking them together because they're all being said one after another during the same occasion. They're said with high energy. They're said in the face of someone who can't really respond the way one might want to respond. And yet they're being said to someone. So it's not even just empty grandstanding. It's like questions as though this person could answer them. What do you think about this book, Anti-Racist Baby? No one's going to answer that question, whoever they are. So there was an effectiveness in what was going on there to really help to create that concrete blob of grievance and fear and outrage and anxiety, pulling on echoes of what's already been said, weaving them together in a really effective, concrete way, and helping them be used going forward as a kind of creation of a recipe for social destruction, right? That's what we watched, was the acting out of a vision of social destruction tied to the opposition in the same way that, Mr. Clingman And in that sense, even the Federalists talking about Jefferson as being no Christian, in one way or another, it's the breakdown of society. And I'm going to proclaim that loudly from the national stage, and people are going to believe me. And that's going to be powerful. And I'm not inventing it out of nowhere, because it's pulling on threads, right? People have been talking all the time. It's no surprise, like child pornography, critical race theory, religion, education, right? All these, we've been hearing about these in one way or another. They've been politicized for a while. So none of these individually are new. They're just being brought together here, on one occasion, to create this very effective, I want to say image, but it isn't just image, feeling, motivation for the idea that society might, you put them all together and society, American society will collapse and everything wonderful about America will collapse, because all of those things for some people touch on something that they see as essential for American society, and the exaggeration of them or the creation of some of them ties to fear so effectively that they become powerful political tools. So that's my main point. I basically just wanted to say that what we saw was not just grandstanding. There's a long history of people standing up in the national government, in Congress, in other national, on other national platforms around the country, to say something at a moment that's important, and pulling together powerful things that have already been said, mixing them together, creating a vocabulary or an essence of angst that is so effective and so good at touching on the emotion that's going to really fuel a population of people to really believe that society might break down, that those become formative kinds of moments in the realm of politics. That's what I wanted to say about the hearings, the confirmation hearings. And I just wanted to say that, as always, I often end my comments here by asking everyone to think about anything that people say that make you want to clench your fists and howl in outrage. That's probably the intention of those comments. Someone wants you to have an extreme response, and the thing to do at that moment is to take a breath and think about why, and to think about what's being said, and to think about what you really think about the events surrounding what's being said, and whether, I think I used this quote before. It was it fear harvesting, anger harvesting, outrage harvesting, with some wonderful phrase like that, that's what sometimes this is, right? Is the harvesting of those kinds of emotions. Be aware that that's happening. Don't be part of the harvest. Right? Think about what people are saying. Words matter tremendously in a climate like we're existing in now, because they become concrete very quickly. And once they become a concrete fear, something specific will happen, it can be very hard to undo that kind of a statement. Okay, I will end there because I see that we are even a minute or two past our time, but mug, I knew, see, you got me really trained. I'm sure, having said that, at some point, I will indeed forget the mug, and no one will say mug, and then I will feel shamed. But I had a little problem trying to think about what today's mug would be, but given that I was talking about North Carolina so much, and given that in my book I talk a lot about Southerners weaving together those sorts of things on the national stage with great effect, my mug is from a conference telling about the South. It's from a conference about, in the South, it's when I was at UVA, about the South, the nature of the South, which I thought was appropriate. Sorry, Southerners watching me, I'm not trying to deliberately smack at the South, but they were very good at this particular technique in the years leading up to the Civil War. Okay, Grace has vanished. Hopefully she'll, oh, there she is, you're back. Excellent. Okay, so I just had my mug moment.
Yep. And I have a strange background, but a fun one. Does anyone recognize, here, I'll after this have to figure out. Any guesses what I've got here?
Making hay.
He says my dog got bingo. It is, yes, Beth, this is TR. Yes, I figured.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, reaching a little bit, but he sort of coined that phrase, bully pulpit, and so I thought I'd go look for a unique picture of him, because the Library of Congress has quite the TR collection, videos, not video, films, photographs, all sorts of things that are not his typical political poses. So this is Teddy Roosevelt making hay in 1905.
which
Just to
is which
humanize
is
those politicians, as you always try to do, Joanne.
yeah, no, which is wonderful, and which is why in the title I didn't just leave it Bully Pulpit, because that is Roosevelt in the presidency, and I
Yep.
wanted it to be broader than that. But indeed, that is a wonderful image, and I can't believe who was it who
He
guessed
was,
that right off the
I think
cuff.
it was it Rabbi Beth who got it?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
that was
he's
impressive.
always got his like he's wearing a safari hat even to make hay and his ridiculous pants every time. So
Because his image,
yeah.
Anyway, okay.
Yes, well thank you. That was fascinating. And we do have quite a Beth said it was obvious.
No, give yourself credit.
We do have a lot of questions coming in. Let's see how to
Oh,
choose.
someone is asking, Cece wants you to move your head once more.
Okay. Whoop. Just now I made my chat huge. There we go. So the far, I don't know if you can see, you probably can't see my cursor. The one who's wearing a safari hat and not the straw hat with the regular band.
On
like
the right, the ultimate right.
Yeah, the one with the funny
right.
pants too. He's just not wearing the same outfit as everyone else.
He's dressed for a safari, and yeah.
And my favorite video, I probably mentioned this, my favorite video of him from the Library of Congress is one about his work with preserving bird sanctuaries in the South.
Oh.
But there in the video, he actually lies down on the beach in the same outfit and like puts his head on his hand. It's incredible. Yeah. So you definitely need to go diving into the Library of Congress archives.
Wow.
All right. Somebody got bingo. I must have said Library of Congress. I may have done it.
Okay.
So some of our questions here.
Okay.
This is an interesting one from Cece, and I'm gonna try to pull the more historical threads here because there are a lot of contemporary threads as well. So
I was trying very hard to make it historical. So anyway, go ahead.
Your audience is trying less hard, which is fine. History has a lot to do with the modern day, but as my role here, I'm going to pull the sort of historical questions. But so with Jefferson, there's the fear of the demise of Christianity, which turns out to be overblown. However, there have been times in history when people have said that something scary was going to happen, and it did, or something worse. Like people were saying, there's going to be a civil war, which sounds crazy and overblown until it happens. So, I don't know if this is really a question you can answer, but just be interested in your thoughts about it. How do we draw a line between realistic and unrealistic fears?
Well, I don't think it's so much drawing a line between fears. It's looking to see how they're being spread. Right. So in the case of 1850, if someone had stood up and said, we're moving toward civil war here, right? Because and had gone on and spoke in that vein, again, might be trying to get a response, but it's at least worth pausing for a moment to consider rather than we're going to burn the Capitol down, right? That might be real fear behind that, but what's motivating that isn't anything necessarily real in the sense that you should listen immediately to Mr. Thomas Clingman and believe what he's saying. So I guess it's my long way of saying there's no absolute in which you can say, well, these kinds of fears are not worth thinking about and these are, but I would say you should think about how these fears, these ideas are being introduced, the subtlety and the complexity with which they're being discussed. So in other words, are they being treated like something real, or are they being treated as rhetoric? The fear may be very real, and the rhetoric may be very much reflecting something that could happen and even will happen, but that's not the way to understand if that's true or not, right? The extreme rhetoric is not going to inform you about the reality of a threat. So I guess that's part of my answer. Not so much that you can tell, and it's a very good point that sometimes the things that people are howling about actually do happen, like a civil war. But if as I said, if someone had stood up and said, I think we're going to have a civil war, and I think, I think we're going to have a civil war, and I think the South is going to beat the North, and here are the 5 reasons I think there's going to be a civil war. Well, you would listen to that. You might not believe it, but it's actually someone presenting information and making a claim rather than howling. So
Mhm.
it's the howling component, in a sense, that motivated me to do this, because that's not about anything credible. That's about the howling, and pulling together threads that justify it. So it's partly the way a message is conveyed that I'm encouraging people to think about.
That makes a lot of sense. Dale says, and Dale, who you got to meet recently, Jefferson made a lot of comments about religion, but was it his editing of the Bible that created the most interest or fear?
I don't think that was necessarily highly publicized. He spoke a lot. He had a lot to say, about religion in one way or another. It neither picks my pocket. I'm not going to get the quote right, or hurts my bones or whatever. Like, people should have their freedom of religion. He was wanted to disestablish the Anglican Church in Virginia, right? So he clearly was someone who had liberal, in not a modern sense, but liberal views about religion generally. And I think that also the idea that, he was a deist, and that he wasn't a real Christian. I think he was open to that kind of mud throwing because of the way he talked about and treated religion. I don't, and it would be a really good question. I just don't honestly recall how or if the Jefferson Bible got publicity. I don't
Mhm.
recall ever reading people saying, I mean, you would think you would hear, right? He cut
Yeah.
apart the Bible. I mean, because he really cut and pasted passages of the Bible that he thought were true versus the ones that were false. And he believed that Jesus was a kind of a teacher, but not necessarily more than that. And so he stripped out a lot of what he would have considered the like supernatural priestcraft woven around the real Jesus, and created his own Bible. My students, when I talk about this to my undergraduates, are always stunned. Like, he did what? So imagine, in that moment in time, if people knew he was cutting and pasting the Bible to create his own, that I would think that I would recall some of the howling. But it's a good question that I'm sure people are now looking up. But I don't know if or how that ultimately was publicized, or if that was a much later revelation when people went through his papers.
Right. Thank you. I'm sure, yeah, Tim will get into that and figure out exactly when news of the Jefferson Bible first broke. Gloria says, were only Southerners arousing fear in the 1850s, or did Northerners do the same thing? Do we see some howling on the other side as well?
Yes.
She says, could it be part of the American angst to do with this at election time?
So the short answer is that yes, at election time, there's going to be a lot of howling. So Gloria, you're right that elections, almost in a democratic context, elections invite howling, because any democracy is grounded in one way or another on public opinion. The way to gain public opinion to get that kind of approval is to get people's attention, make extreme claims. So it makes perfect sense that there's a lot of howling surrounding elections. And it is also true. Northerners, some of the howling from the North was more in line with things like the Fugitive Slave Act and the idea that if enslaved people escaped to the North, that they could then be re-enslaved and brought back. So in other words, the South and slavery was exerting itself into the North in a way that made Northerners anxious. But the sort of howling that society will break down and it's all over, that was a special kind of howling that was centered on the end of slavery. So I would say that you're right, Gloria, that it happens a lot during elections, and it's not only the South, but in the lead up to the Civil War, the South were the ones very much trying to create the image that they're going down, right? The Northerners are going to destroy everything we hold dear, and thus everything that is America, and we need to protest. So that was a moment in time. So howling, yes. Specific howling, also, yes.
Got it. All right. And we've talked about this before, but Cece wants to know when there is howling, and when there has been historically, and it's very powerful, right? It's designed to play on emotions, and many people do react to outrage. Is there a way, and has there been a way historically, to kind of talk people back from that once they've bought into the outrage?
Well, a great example of that, I think the answer is yes, several ways. A great example of that would be the McCarthy hearings. At the moment, have you no decency, sir?
Yeah.
That moment in which McCarthy was attacking this young man who didn't deserve to get attacked and who wasn't even present. And the prosecutor on the other side during that hearing, his name is escaping me right now, said to McCarthy, really, you're going to attack him? Have you no decency? So he was using emotion, and in a sense, an extreme kind of a claim that certainly grabbed at people in the room and those who were watching to, I don't even want to say expose something, frame something differently so that people saw it differently. So in that case, I think it's emotion against emotion that kind of pulled people back a bit. So I think that's one way to do it. But I also think that, credible, and I'm going to say this, and then we're all going to say, yeah, but nowadays that doesn't work, which very much is true. But generally speaking, I would say people who come forward and actually have arguments and evidence and pieces of things that can, they can say, here are the 5 reasons why I think this will happen, or the 5 reasons I think this won't happen, rather than howling that it's going to happen. There are going to be people who buy into the howling and they're just going to stay there. And we all know that, and we can see that happening. But there are going to be a lot of people. The howling makes it seem as though that there's a majority of people believing something, right? And I think about this all the time because I'm on Twitter far too often. And on Twitter, there's a lot of howling, right? And I think it makes you feel like everyone thinks X. And in part, you think that because they're really loud and really active, some of the people who think X. And so we can't, in this age of social media, allow ourselves to be pulled into that either, right? It's a really easy way to spread the howling, is particularly things like Twitter. So, and Twitter, although there are historians who really effectively use evidence, right? Like Kevin Cruz from Princeton, my friend Kevin Cruz, really, and actually Seth Kotler too, another friend on Twitter, who just are like, here is the argument for why this is untrue. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of evidence, newspaper, front pages of newspapers, copies of bills, which to someone looking on and not invested in one side or the other would be extremely believable. But if you're in the howling mode, I don't think you're gonna, that kind of argument isn't going to appeal to you. So for some people at some points in time, the howling is hard to refute, but the howling is not the majority. And there are a lot of people who are watching and debating with themselves what they think. So it's always worthwhile presenting things in a credible way, refuting things that people are saying that are absolutely untrue by saying, not screaming, you're a liar, but instead saying, no, that's really not true. And here's why we know that. Yes, the people who want to believe it are going to believe it anyway. But the fact that you're calling it out matters. And some people will say, oh, like yesterday, when a senator said the Constitution, I'm not going to use names, the Constitution promises us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I went on Twitter and said, no, it doesn't. You're quoting the Declaration of Independence. And now like 50,000 people have liked that little tweet. On privately, in a direct message, I said to a few friends, I feel bad about that because I don't like causing a pile-on. And it went crazy. People, you're stupid. And they were, howling at her and screaming at her, and to such a degree that I just muted the entire conversation because that wasn't what I was trying to do. I was just trying to call out the fact that what's being said here has no grounding, in some ways reality, that this isn't even the Constitution. And what some of the friends, all historians, said to me in reply was something along the lines of what I've said here. Like, you know what? Mute the conversation. That's your friend on Twitter, and walk away from it because the fact of the matter is this needs to be called out, particularly from people claiming the Constitution as the source of their arguments. If they are clearly showing that they don't have a good sense of the Constitution, someone needs to step forward and say, no, actually, that's not from the Constitution. I didn't say anything mean or nasty. Other people were doing that, and I actually did mute the conversation. But I do think it's important to, in a calm and not howling way, step forward at some points and call out some of what's being said for what it is. And there will be people who see that kind of statement for what it is, and we'll pause. I know that's like cheery, Joanne, but I believe that to be true. And I've seen that happen again on Twitter, where people who really don't agree with me will I will have engaged with them. They will have been following me now at this point for like years. And sometimes we engage as like regular people, and then sometimes they say horrible things to me. And at one point I actually said to one of them, who we talked about birds, right? There'd been a bird, there actually had been, there was was it in Australia? There was a big fire, and they were trying to get birds, rescue birds, and they needed bird cages. And I sort of went onto Twitter and was like, anybody have a way to get bird cages to Australia? Because of course I did. And this person stepped forward and said, I can do that, and ended up being a person who actually liked to step forward and say things that he knew would get me politically upset. And at some point I actually said to him, you just said, all Democrats are whatever. I'm on the left. Do you really think I'm like that? And he said, well, no, I don't. It's like, well, then why do you say it? And it was actually, it was a moment of conversation with just a simple question. I didn't say, how dare you? It was just like, really? You? So this is like way too blue sky-ish, but sometimes tone matters more than you think it would. Another goofy example. Yesterday, I was being driven somewhere. I was like a taxi driver, and I talked to everybody. So we were having a conversation. Actually, it was a driver who brought me to and took me away from where I was going. Very nice gentleman. We had actually very nice conversations. And when he was driving me to Jamestown, we ended up talking politics. And we do not agree on politics. And we had a very nice, normal conversation. And the next day, when he drove me back to the airport, he said, I went home and I told my wife that I just drove for an hour in a car with a liberal woman from a blue state, and we just talked through politics. And it struck him that we managed to do that. And it struck me that we managed to do that. And I don't know if I changed anything he thought, but the simple fact that, he said something and I was like, I got my phone here. Like, I looked that up. I was like, but we were doing it in good humor. That mattered. So I'm anti-howling. But the howling, constant message here on History Matters, emotion, right? That's what I'm interested in, generally speaking, in politics from earlier eras. Emotion being deployed as a tool of politics. Really effective, really needs us to stand back and have a perspective on it.
All right, thank you. How did bunkum relate to the situation of armed legislators in the 1850s?
Well, I don't think that caused it. I do think, David Outlaw is correct in saying that bunkum days, they didn't always cause fights, but they often did, because the howling, the rhetoric would be full of, they're a bunch of liars and they're out for whatever. And there was only so much that people could sit and listen to that kind of language without getting, emotional and roused up to act in Congress itself. I think Southerners were always likely to be armed in Congress, not all of them, but the most likely people to be armed were Southerners. And actually, good old David Outlaw, in 1850, he, it's not because of Clingman, but it's an interesting question. While things were raging about the Compromise of 1850, he and a friend try to count how many people in the House have guns or weapons. And he comes up with the number 70. It's like, we're not sure, but we think 70. So I don't think that moment caused people to arm necessarily, but it definitely caused people to think about who had arms and who didn't have arms. By the time you get to the late 1850s, there are people who are arming themselves explicitly because they think there will be bloodshed on the floor. A really striking letter from a South Carolina congressman who has a famous quote that gets quoted all the time in books on the coming of the Civil War, in which he says, everyone here, if they don't have one gun, they have two, or some such thing like that. But what the interesting part of the letter, of course, is what comes after that, in which he says, and this is going to be a bad paraphrase, I'm not comfortable carrying a gun. I never have been. And the one time in my life before, when I did carry a gun for a while, I put it aside. I just don't like it. But the fact of the matter is, I have a gun in my desk here in Congress. And the reason I have a gun in my desk here in Congress is because and these are not his words, but it's basically what he says. If warfare breaks out in here, I'm fighting with the South. He's predicting that in the Capitol, right? And he arms himself because by, I think it's 1858, maybe is when he says that. By that point in time, good old Mr. Clingman's claim about, we're going to bring on the war here, it's going to be flaming violence, to this fellow, John Henry Hammond actually is who it is, could happen. So he goes and gets a gun and puts it in his desk just in case it does. That's still, there are certain pieces of evidence that when I think about them from that book, they just give me chills. That's one, right? If warfare breaks out here, I'm fighting with the South. Okay, that's that. If someone says that in that way and then acts in a way to back up that kind of statement, think about what that means about what he is saying is in the realm of possibility. It's mind-blowing, right? It's the sort of stuff you wouldn't imagine, even in the lead up to the Civil War, you wouldn't necessarily imagine as being possible, and yet it was. So it's a great example of the ideas that Clingman is spinning around, not because of him, but that same idea. Chaos, chaos, we're all going down. Who knows what the North will do? Those ideas are certainly helping to fuel this environment in which this fellow put a loaded gun in his desk just in case.
All right. Well,
I see people cheering on Gloria, who said, using the howling in classrooms so that students can realize what it is and how they can make decisions based on ideas rather than emotions. Yes, Gloria. Yes, I applaud that too, along with everybody else.
well, would you like one more quick question here? I know I'm cutting it a little close. All right. So you mentioned that, when we put Bully Pulpit up here, you think TR, and obviously I did. I knew you weren't talking about him, but I can never resist diving into his photo collection. But that's an example of using the presidency as the bully pulpit. But we also see it, obviously, you see it in Congress, both historically and in the modern day. Is there a pattern? I mean, usually do you have both the president and Congress using it at the same time? Does it tend to shift? Does Congress tend to use it more? And are there just any patterns historically as to who tends to be using their position as the bully pulpit?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, so I'll answer it partly. One thing that's really interesting to consider along those lines, and it actually relates partly to Clingman, is that for a chunk of the 19th century, the center of national politics was not the presidency, but was Congress. And the most of newspapers, the pages of newspapers, the column inches of newspapers had congressional news. They would publish, versions of the oratory in Congress. People knew to a remarkable degree, if they read the newspaper, what was being said in Congress. And what that, of course, means is that becomes a really effective bully pulpit, right, place to speak from, because the public is paying attention to that to a much greater degree, potentially, than what a president says, which is not what we expect. We're in such an age when the president and the executive branch has such power. But in this period, that wasn't necessarily true. And certainly in my research, I could see all kinds of moments when, as a matter of fact, there's one occasion when a congressman stands up and says something threatening and includes a reporter in it, and I'm going to come to get you too. And the reporter just stops reporting that congressman, right? He's like, yeah, okay, well, you don't exist anymore. And the congressman ultimately has to apologize because the howling isn't going anywhere, right? He's like alone in a room talking to himself and no one can see what he's saying. So when Congress matters, there's going to be more of that kind of language, but past a certain point, the executive is where all the attention is. Not that it's always the same. And of course, right now, in the recent past, Congress has been taking a lot of our attention for a lot of good reasons. So I would say, like so many other things in history, I think there are patterns, but I would also say that Congress is used more effectively and more frequently for that purpose in the early and particularly the mid 19th century. One last thing, I know we're running out of time, but there's a magazine that comes out in 1858, I believe, called Vanity Fair, which has nothing to do with the current Vanity Fair. And in my book, I jokingly call it Congressional Fights Quarterly, because so much violence in there. And they have this feature that they have in that magazine where they will read through the congressional debate of the last week, and pull out the most ridiculous statements and thread them together into a conversation that this is a different kind of howlingly goofy, but it's only funny if you know the context in which these one sentences were said. And the fact that that feature was in this repeatedly in this magazine meant that, like, I knew all of the references because I was reading the congressional record and I was reading the newspapers. You would have to have a tremendously deep knowledge of congressional debate to be laughing at that column in this magazine, which just drives home the degree to which really the sensibilities of people to national politics were very different in that time period. Okay, I see that we are now a little bit over. I will very briefly say, because I saw civility in congressional debate, there actually is a pretty good historical literature on how members of Congress should behave. If anyone out there happens to have my most recent book, the footnotes will have a lot of that stuff. There's a lot of discussion of it and what it means. But of course, I just wrote a book about people paying no attention to the rules of Congress for several decades. But it is true that there's a lot of, and there are books and collections of articles on that very topic. Okay, well, so let me explain what will happen now. We will now segue to the after party. What that means is, if you are here and have joined us through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and someone's going to get bingo. Poof, we will be in the after party. You don't have to do anything or go anywhere. During the after party, we stop recording so that we can be a little freer and easier in our conversation. So stick around if you'd like to join us for that. If you are joining us on Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook and join us through the NCHE website. And to get into this conversation, it is ncheteach.org/conversations. That will bring you into the after party. One way or another, whether I see you in the after party or not. Thank you for being part of this community this morning. As always, I must say thank you for engaging in democracy, the democratic process, this kind of thoughtful conversation about our government every Friday morning. I of course invite you to come back again next Friday. I have no idea what we will be talking about, but as always, I will try to come up with it before Thursday and potentially fail. And I hope that everyone will have a good and a safe week coming up. So hopefully come next week and bring your friends.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you very much. And again, if you like this, check everything else out at ncheteach.org. And Joanne, thank you again. This was wonderful.
Thanks everybody for coming. And do stick around if you would like to join the after party.